Hi, I'm Leon Lovelace, and this is Unstoppable Force. Now, I need your help. I need you to go to my GoFundMe campaign. I'm putting a link in the description box below. Go donate to it so I could do this show full time instead of just part time. But I got a big story for you, and it's about how Cenk Uygur got pushed out of the leadership of the Justice Democrats. Now, this was a few days ago. I think it was like 3 or 4 days ago. Can't quite remember, but a few people did videos on it. H.A. Goodman did one, and Jamal Thomas did one. So I watched theirs. And finally, fucking Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk, he finally does one of these big stories about TYT because he's totally skipped the story about Jordan Cheriton. Mike Figueroa also did, so he shouldn't have done that. I think that was a little misstep on him for missing this one, but Kyle finally did a story about this, so that was actually good. But I'm going to talk about him a little bit later because there were some problems that he presented when he was doing his story, but I'm going to try to cover a lot of the sexist and just damning stuff that Cenk did. Especially, this was quite a few years ago, but he was still pushed out, so it's still relevant. And one is about how co-host Anna Kasparian experienced sexism when she first worked for the Young Turks. Because I actually remembered her mentioning a couple times when I was watching the Young Turks back then, the main show, that John Iadarola got to host the first hour before she did. I was thinking, what the fuck? Why would that be? Because Cenk Uygur always talks about how they're progressive and they look out for women and they're trying to make sure they're working to make our world a more equitable place, that sort of thing. But of course, especially back in the early days, he wasn't quite that progressive. But I'll go with Anna's quote, because she has said this on the show, but here's her quote. "I used to think feminists were unbearable. Like, feminism? Who the fuck needs feminism? Ugh, they just play victim. And I'm going to work hard and I'm going to get what I want through working hard," Kasparian begins. Then I started working, I'm like, oh, holy shit, there's a lot of sexism. And not necessarily in this company, although, no, I'm going to keep it real. Look, TYT has come a super long way since I started working here, but there were issues. There were issues in the beginning, okay, like John Iadarola hosting the first hour before I hosted the first hour. Then why was that? Like, that was some bullshit, right? And it's even a bigger problem because she went to school for journalism, so she had the official schooling to be on a news show on the first hour. And John Iadarola, he has a 4-year degree, but it's not in journalism. It's in something else I don't really remember. And then also Anna, I think she worked for the TYT for like a year or two before he even stepped in the building. So that's another problem right there. She had seniority and she had the official education to do that job before he should have been doing it. Oh, and this is from the gatewaypundit.com, because some of this information, it was like on the old version of the Young Turks website. But of course, I don't think that really exists anymore. But someone was able to dig up some of that information, and they were able to give it to the Gateway Pundit. And the second thing that the Gateway Pundit has on Cenk being sexist is Uygur tells a female anti-feminist activist Karen Strahan to go make him a ham sandwich. Right, I'm not going to read the quote because you guys should. I'm going to put a link in the description box for this video or for this page, and it has some of that clip on the video. And he makes that statement because he's obviously being a jackass when he says that, because he's implying that she's not giving credit to the people that fought for women's suffrage and women's right to vote. But she goes into detail about why plenty of the women at that time weren't really for it. And it goes into detail, and it goes into a lot of the subtleties and a lot of the history that the establishment doesn't really want to talk about. And a lot of it's because it's not just a straight black and white issue. It's that there's some nuanced issues with why people didn't want or did want certain things. But the establishment doesn't want to teach us that. So we just get fed a very simple narrative about some of the issues that's happened in the past. And of course, that's a huge fucking problem. That the establishment doesn't want to tell us our own fucking history. So that, for me, that statement wasn't really him being sexist as him. And that one, he's being satirical in his sexism because he's saying, hey, you're not really giving props. But the big problem was that he listened to her really good explanation about what went on, and then he kind of disregarded it. And that was the big problem with at least that interview. Was she gave a good example. He said, oh, that's who gives a shit about that. You still need to agree with me. And then here's some of the stuff that also really, I guess it really led Cenk to talk about or describe himself as a talk show host. He never talked about how he was a political pundit and a talk show host, or he was a news and talk show host. He never talked about how he was a political commentator and talk show host. He always just described himself as a talk show host. And it bothered me for probably just the last year, maybe year to 2 years that I watched it. So I was thinking, why does he keep just, in a way, just downgrading his position as, in a way, a show as just being a talk show when it's a progressive news show and a talk show, I guess. I think a lot of it's because of the reason why he started the show in the first place and how he ran his show in the early days. Because he was a lot more sexist back then than I think he is today. But it's been a while since I watched this show. But here's a rent statement. Here's not one of his clips, but this is pretty gross statement right here, because in a 2002 archive of Uygur's website for his radio show, progressive personality wrote that, quote, obviously the genes of women are flawed. They are poorly designed creatures who do not want to have sex nearly as often as needed for the human race to get along peaceably and fruitfully. I'll go down a little bit. He added that a hookup a decent amount defined as at least make out with a new girl every 6 to 8 weeks and have sex with a steady girl at least once a week. But it seems like there's a sea of tits here. I'm drinking in tiny droplets. I want to dive in the whole goddamn ocean. Alright, and then here's a paragraph, but he talks about some places they like that he quit law to be a talk show host. But in Miami, when he lived at the time, the women heavily frowned upon that. And here's the part I'll start. I've never seen girls get so turned off as when I tell a Miami girl I no longer practice law. This reaction is sickening in its depraved, whorish blatantness. So that's pretty sexist and pretty disgusting statement right there. Because women weren't just being whores because they wanted a guy that made a good living or had a very prominent position or prominent job, that sort of thing. So yeah, even though he said he was a conservative back in 2002 and 2001, that's still pretty harsh and pretty terrible shit to be saying. And I also think that's another reason why he always considered himself a talk show host, because then he has the green light to actually be more outrageous and more braggadocious and a little more raw, and especially in sex and other issues, other topics that he wanted to talk about than me or any other independent media show host that wants to cover the news and not such a scandalous way, because yeah, it also gives them the green light to be more scandalous. Oh, and then Uygur also writes that he has specific rules for dating, and his rules indicate that there must be some serious making out by the third date, and if not by the fourth, you're done. Then he says, additionally, there must be orgasm by the fifth date. If not, there will be no sixth date to give you a second chance. He doesn't say the orgasms, his orgasm or hers, but I guess for him it didn't matter. Someone had to have an orgasm by the fifth date. So, I mean, just writing it out, it seems pretty harsh and really sexist. But yeah, really just writing it out and having it for the public to see just seems a lot more crude than if he just told his closest guy friends. So it's just, yeah, it just looks really bad. And it's funny because he says this stuff that we must have an orgasm by the fifth date. But I'm not telling girls to be sluts. They don't have to do that. But at least for me, in a way, they kind of have to. I guess that's what he's saying. But he says, but there's a bounds of reason. And he goes on, I have no intention of going out with someone in the long run without a reasonable amount of sex. And these rules set the reasonable bounds. Ignore them at your peril, the progressive road. So yeah, I think everybody has their own personal rules on sex, but just writing them out and saying ignore these rules I have set at your peril just looks really bad. And it doesn't look really welcoming to women at all. So yeah, it's understandable why the Justice Democrats said, oh shit, someone dug this shit up, he's got to fucking go. Oh shit. And it's really interesting because Cenk, of course, he just bloviated and just ran wild with just yelling and just going off about, oh my gosh, Trump said grab him by the pussy, how dare he say such things. He needs to get out of office. He can't be made president of the United States just because of that statement. So of course, yeah, it was pretty bad that President Trump did say that before he was president. But pretty sure he also made that statement like 10 or so years ago. So even though that was quite a while ago, Cenk didn't say, well, it was a long time ago, so maybe we could give him a second chance. Because here's my criticism of Kyle Klinsky's videos. He was talking about, oh, I'm reading this, and this has to be satirical, because this is just over the top sexist. So, yeah, it's satirical. But when you watch his videos back then, he wasn't putting any qualifiers about him making any jokes or anything like that. Or saying. Yeah, there's nothing to indicate that. And then also when you put it in writing, it's a little bit harder to put in nuance qualifiers that's letting the readers know that you're being a satirist. So I think it's because Cenk is Kyle Klinsky's boss that he was like, no, he can't just accept that Cenk Uygur was just as sexist and maybe just as racist as some of the conservatives that just are blatantly obvious about how they don't give a shit about black people or Hispanic people. And they say, just fuck it. I don't give a shit about those people. Then also, what Kyle did that I didn't agree with was after he stopped reading pretty much all throughout this whole article about Cenk's dirty past. He just had a he just displayed a picture of the Justice Democrats logo for it was like 10 minutes or so. And I don't know why the hell he did that, because if he was sad and mopey, he should have put his face on the camera and been all sad and mopey, because he also talked about he was also stepping down as a board member for Justice Democrats, and because he went into detail about their role for Justice Democrats, because Cenk Uygur is also on the board. And it makes sense that since they started up the organization, they'd be a board member. And it's interesting that the staff couldn't kick the board member out. Because he talked about how they just said, if he doesn't step down, we're just going to all leave. So it'd have been really bad if Cenk didn't step down after all this shit came out, and then the whole staff left. So yeah, it would have been a huge problem for a lot of people that are paying attention to politics and Justice Democrats if they saw Cenk Uygur stay after these statements came out, and then the whole staff left. So yeah, it'd have been pretty bad for that organization. Oh, and then also tell you guys a little inside baseball about my setup, because with this digital camera I'm using, it has a 20-minute timer, so I try not to make videos longer than that, because then I have issues with it shutting off and I'm not knowing, because I also don't have a viewfinder to see what actually the camera is capturing. So I gotta upgrade this digital camera soon, because sometimes it's just a big problem. So I shot quite a bit, so I gotta try to figure out where I am. So also with Cenk and Kyle not being on the board of Justice Democrats, maybe some people might think that they're a more credible organization, because it's not media members actually also being part of a political organization or running it really. And this is also what Nico House talked about as a media organization, or owner of a media organization, also starting up a different organization. You have a vested interest in making sure you cover that in the best light, and invested in having that organization succeed, so you're not really going to criticize that organization at all. And Holly Seeger and Debbie, I think her name is, from the same progressive, I think she's talked about how one of them talks about how there's some issues with the Justice Democrats, because they're not just running progressive candidates anywhere and everywhere. That in some issues, and not issues, but some districts and some regions, they're going and running candidates where they're likely to get a win. And when they're running against a progressive incumbent, that really doesn't help the people of that district at all. So that's really problematic. So I got to really dig in and see if that's happening for sure for myself, and to see if there's any more places where they're doing this. Because then I'm really going to rail off on Cenk Uygur and Justice Democrats, period. Then I had more camera issues with my battery, so now I got to find my spot again. I didn't put this in my original, I didn't talk about this originally, but then he talks about how the website is part of an arm of the Young Turks show on the radio. It will soon showcase such lovely features and pictures of young virginal interns who work with us on the show. So that also looks really bad and really disgusting. And plus, they probably weren't virgins in the first place, because if they're 18 or older, 18 and 21, they probably weren't virgins. So I don't know, just putting a virginal makes you think of sex for some reason, and they were his employees. And since that was in the early days, they might have been unpaid too. So also, jeez, man. But again, that's him being the talk show host and being edgy and being overly bombastic and sexist too. So it's just not good. And here's another one where he's having a double standard about sexual harassment. But the big thing is that he's railed against conservatives for saying sexist and racist shit. And, a few years, or quite a bit of years ago, 10 plus years ago, he said the same shit. So he's a hypocrite like a lot of these other conservatives are. I guess that's also what makes it even worse, is that he said this shit, but he wants to rail against them for saying that same shit he did. But at least there's no allegations of him committing sexual assault, because that might really take down quite a bit of their viewership if that came out, especially if it was multiple women. But so far it's just, also with the racism, this is pretty bad, because this is back in 01. And he's still, I think he's 29 at the youngest back at this time. It's a post about lawyers for 34 Native American tribes filing a lawsuit against tobacco companies for deliberately targeting Indian teens. Uygur wrote that these redskins show up everywhere there's a buck to be made these days. And then he puts in parentheses, by the way, I actually think redskin is a rare ethnic term that actually is offensive. I'm only using it now because they've made me angry. But that's how racism usually is now. It's because you've really pushed people to not be openly racist. So whenever they're mad at that minority group, like black people or Hispanic people, then they say, oh, that N-word, or that wetback, or, or that redskin. So, and it's a legitimate gripe for those Native Americans, is that the law is that tobacco companies can't really advertise towards teenagers. And for deliberately targeting Indian teenagers, yeah, that's a legitimate gripe to say, hey, we need to crack down on them for doing something illegal. Especially since they're a very small minority group. They're much smaller in population than even black people, so they have less power in society than black people. So sometimes, yes, as a group, Native American people are going to have to go and fight to make sure they're not getting oppressed or being taken advantage of by corporations, like tobacco corporations, for instance. And they might not even have the lawsuit financially big enough so they could be, set for lifetime and have their children have a bunch of money to inherit too. So, I mean, for him to just say, oh my gosh, they're trying to make a buck, it's pretty despicable right there. But this was back in 01, so hopefully he's definitely not this guy, because this is pretty fucking bad. Yeah, because it says here, his quote, now you're going to try to convince me that these Indian kids would not have smoked if it weren't for the big bad tobacco companies. Bullshit. They saw the peace pipe buried up your ass long before they ever saw a cigarette ad. Like he says a lot, it's total projection. Since in the movies they talk about how Native Americans would smoke the Mary Jane, that they're going to automatically smoke tobacco. But he doesn't know if those teenagers smoke weed or not, so, or how much those Native Americans and those tribes smoke marijuana. So him just automatically saying, oh, they smoke weed is, total projection, and that's pretty fucked up. Then there's another story, but I'm gonna skip that, because one of the worst things that's been written was David Kohler wrote about the teenage girls in Pennsylvania. Because I thought it was Cenk that wrote that, but because I was wondering why David Kohler is getting pushed out of the Justice Democrats, and he might be a board member too, and that's why it's important that they noted that Kohler is getting pushed out. But Kohler's the one that wrote about the girls were whores in training. That's really sexist, and that's terrible. But the worst part about this whole issue is Little spoiled brat. Bitch young American girls on the way to becoming abused porn actresses. That's really bad. But, or, here's a critical part. Dispensable property in a New York City prostitution ring. So why does he, I don't see why he looks at 3 young girls walking down the street, automatically think they're going to be fucking property, fucking slaves in a prostitution ring. Sex slaves, just, oh, that's what they're going to be. I see them girls, they're going to be sex slaves. So we shouldn't give one fuck about them girls at all. And that's worse than anything else that's been written here. A lot of this stuff is pretty disgraceful, but that's the fucking worst. I think I'll read the whole quote on here. Oh no, I'll skip one part because this just talks about the whole quote about him saying it. But it says, the post continued, I asked, I think before Cenk came, if these girls had ever had sex. By the reaction, I was pretty sure 2 of them did, and the youngest of the 3 maybe not. That's really weird that you see some 3 teenage girls, because they're probably 29 to 32. He's automatically thinking about sex. They're going to be whores, and they're going to be abused porn stars, or they're going to be sex slaves in a prostitution ring, which is really disgraceful and really fucked up. And then he asks them if they had sex, which is a little inappropriate because they're teenagers and he's much older than them. And like, what are the odds that him and Cenk were going to have a, meaningful discussion about sex with 3 teenage girls they just met and just talked to for like maybe, 5-10 minutes. So it's really weird and really inappropriate. And in a way sexist too, because if they saw 3 teenage boys walking down that street instead of those 3 girls, I don't think they would have talked about, have you had sex before? I don't think he would have asked that. So here's another really bad clip right here. This is an old clip from 2010, so this was 7 years ago, but he's discussing a story when a man was drugged and anally raped by his ex-girlfriend. And Uygur declared that he loves this story. And the rest of the women should be exonerated. That's fucking double standard right there. Because he wouldn't say that if a man anally raped his girlfriend and drugged her, he wouldn't be saying that man should be exonerated because he was good looking. So that's being a hypocrite right there. And then he talks about, I'm super amused by this. Now let's show you, I'm amused by this. Now this is her mugshot. And he talks about how, she's hot. So instead of her being a rapist or being someone that sexually assaulted someone, he talks about, she just overstepped her bounds. Now he's diminishing what she done because she's hot, and they should let her go, like he pronounces and proclaims in his videos. So yeah, he's pretty good showman, and then they write that Uygur also asserts that the rape victim should man up and live with it. So that's pretty fucking bad. That's really shameful right there. And then also goes on about several of the instances where they did clips about how some teacher inappropriately had sex with a minor, usually one of their students. And a lot of times I think it also made the news because the woman was attractive. So it's a little more incentive to talk about that when a lot of people find a woman attractive versus not attractive. Because I've also noticed that whether the Young Turks have covered that story about a teacher trying to think of the term, has sex with an underage person. So it's statutory rape. So when a teacher has statutory rape, I'm always seeing that it's usually an attractive woman. So that's a little bit, it just seems a little problematic when the media only wants to cover those instances and not the instances when it's a woman that's not that attractive to many people, or when it's a guy committing statutory rape, or a male teacher, because I'm sure that happens too. And that's just as big as a problem as when a woman does it. But it goes on a little more, but you guys should check it out because it's pretty bad. But I don't remember if this is in my earlier clips, but some people might think that now that Cenk Uygur and Kyle Kalinske is not in the Justice Democrats anymore, they might be a more credible organization now. But Nico House still said it had hit it right on the point when he talked about how Justice Democrats is only about making sure that progressives go and run as Democrats and try to fix the Democratic Party. So they're invested in the Democratic Party and not in third parties. They might endorse some third party candidates, but I don't think someone that's running the Green Party, an independent, even a Republican Party, or social democratic socialist or any other third party could be labeled as a Justice Democrat. And it actually be kind of weird, and of course it'd be kind of weird and just kind of off the point if people that weren't running the Democratic Party wanted to be a Justice Democrat. But the point is, the TYT and in Secular Talk, they're really invested in just one party over all the others. So that also makes them not really objective when it comes to certain parts of politics, especially when it just comes to political parties in general. Because one problem with our political system is that we have the two-party duopoly, and we don't have several different parties that come and make sure that two parties just don't really the two parties really don't just come and fuck over the masses because it's only two. So people are forced to pick one party and then the other party. So, and then they could just, and they have been just working together to screw the people over. So that's one of the big reasons why I'm not a Democrat, and I'm never gonna be part of the Democratic Party, is just having this two-party duopoly really hurts the people of the United States, and by extension, people all around the world. Because it's easier to have a corrupt system when there's only two parties.